now. Iawn, gawn ni basio'r awenau ymlaen i John, felly. Diolch, John. Da chi ar mute, John?
Sorry.
Dyna ni.
Dyma ni. Right, okay, sorry, dwi'n stryglo agor yr agenda hyn y bryd, felly na i pasio syth ymlaen i Kat.
I'm struggling to open the agenda at the moment, so I'll just pass on to Kat straight away. I think she's the first one on the agenda today.
John.
Sorry.
Na, dim problem.
Na i dal fyny mewn eiliad.
Na, pidwch y poeni, mae'r agenda yma gyda fi fama hefyd, felly...
I have the agenda here as well, so I'll just open it and... Pete is going to...
Situation. Is Pete here? I don't think Pete is here.
Oh, Pete yna. Hi Pete, ydych chi'n iawn? Ydych chi ar mute?
Sorry, ges i draffer logio fewn.
Dim problem. Ie, diolch Pete. Mae Pete, fel o'n i'n deud, yn rhoi diweddariad ar y ffigurau monitor. Da chi wedi siarad efo Dana gyda llaw, Pete?
Do, dwi'n...
Iawn, gret. Gret. Da chi'n rhannu'ch sgrin felly, Pete? Os gennych chi gyflwyniad neu...
Sorry, dwi ar gyntaf, do?
Ydych, sori.
Okay.
Os dyn nhw'n iawn.
Let's go to this. Sorry, dwi wedi colli chi gyd hwn. It's not working very well this morning. Shit, dwi iawn. We're having a few technicals here. Bear with me. Let's see what's going on.
Da chi eisiau ni fynd ymlaen i'r pwynt nesaf, Pete, neu da chi'n...
Do you want us to go on to the next point, Pete, or it's up to you? Do you see my screen now? Yes. Okay, I want to open this. Can you see this? Yes, we can, Pete. These are the latest figures we've had, and thank you for Dana for putting these together. After the bit of a marathon feat of data collection, as you can imagine, after COVID, etc., it was quite a feat doing all of these. I do emphasize that these are figures for 2020. So that is January 2020 till December 2020, not this year. So it's quite interesting because it does reflect what has happened this year, I believe. So I'll just scroll up. The three massives have been done and a few other routes, etc. So I'll just go through these very quickly. The first one is comparing between the three massifs, Snowdon, Glenderau and Cader Idris. Glenderau, well, we say Glenderau, but this includes Ogwen and nothing else. Car parks in Ogwen and Tryfan, West, and Western Buttress, and one or two others, and also Comidwa. The figures for Ogwen, well, those mentioned after the Wyddfa, and the proportionalities, it's like this, which is quite interesting for people to see how it's been carved up. 70% of people go to Snowdon, and a lot fewer to Ogwen, and fewer still to Cader Idris, about 10% really. It depends on the season. And Snowdon, we have had last year, it was a maximum total of 129,000. But you must remember now that most of the figures here for July, August, September. So what's happened, I think, is that, well, where the season runs at the end of April, the main season that is, until middle of October, everything had been kind of condensed into 3 months. Second week of July was first week of July at the end of lockdown. And also the weather had got quite bad halfway through September. So things have dropped off very quickly in October. So it's flatlining basically afterwards. So everything has been condensed into 3 months rather than 5 to 6 months. And during those days of the week, from Monday to Sunday, you can see there that the figures are quite high over the weekends. These are the dates, the graphical representation of days. So Friday, it's a bit very oddly, last year, Monday was busier than Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday, and that varies from one year to the other. One year it can be a Wednesday, another it can be Tuesday, another Monday. It depends on the weather. But as you can see, Saturday and Sunday's busier. Saturday is the busiest day, and combined with bank holidays, those are pretty serious figures. So 2020, the mean figure for Snowdon, well, has dropped last year. It's round about 480,500. Well, it has been higher. It has been much higher, 584 in 2019. But they are pretty significant figures anyway. And then we are heading, I would say, probably the next couple of years with we're heading for about 600,000. Again, that reflects very strongly the weather. If we have a very good season, then that does affect the people walking. And then we've got the overall figure, 14 to 2020 here. You'll see a huge drop off with COVID, etc. So really, with the figures before that, they're quite accurate. So I can put a direct equation to this, how much we've lost. And the others as well, Cader and Ogwen, because we know what the indicators are. We know how long they stay and how much they spend. So it's not rocket science to give some kind of idea how much you've lost. I haven't made equations, but if I need to, I can do it. It's a bit long-winded, but certainly not rocket science. Also, comparing the 2 years, 19 and 20, 20 there, 19 in red and 20 in black. So flatlining until June. Then things have opened up beginning of July and things have shot up. And very strangely, it had reached the point where we usually were at that 100,000. So August bank holiday, that is. So I think that is the busiest time. So almost it reflects the exact figure in August, what we usually get. So that was very interesting. And then it's pushed out a little bit in September last year because the children hadn't gone back to school. So that pushed out to kind of halfway through September, third week in September, and then the weather turned. So there was a rapid decline afterwards. If anybody wants to ask a question about Snowdon at all, are you willing for me to carry on? Shake your heads. Okay. Excuse me. Back to Ogwen and Idwal now. The profile is very similar. There you can see the kick-off point and the fall-off point in October. Usually in October it's a bit slower because after August you've got kind of grandparents come out to playtime, and they are here until probably halfway through November usually. So the bell shaped there would just be drawn out a little bit more to November there. So the weather had been very bad after September, so that's the reason, I imagine. You will see as well flatlining March, April and May and June. Absolutely zero activity. But in May, there's a little bit of activity. You see local people around, and then chances as we are. So fundamentally, statistically, it's flatlining. And as well, during the weeks from Monday through to Saturday, the same trend. As I say, it does reflect exactly what has happened on Snowdon and also Cadir Idris. It's quite interesting, actually. Again, the Monday was busier, and then on Thursday, and that's very odd, gone to Friday. So there's a quirk in the weather or something, surely. And then figures comparing over the years from 14 to 2020 is quite interesting, actually. We have 3-4 points to measure, and you can see there Idwal. Also, the red figures, 2000 and what was it? 19 and 20 is a flat line. Total lack of activity and a spike then, interesting, to go above the spikes for 2019. So that means in Ogwen that more people have been out during the same time of the season. And that's why we've had all the business of off-road parking, fly camping, parking everywhere. So that gap between those two highest points, so that I'd imagine, that's what has happened there. So it had slowed down then, the flow off since October with the weather again, really bad in October. So, and completely flat lining then. So after that spike, that's gone further up quite a bit compared to last year or the year before. Then Cadir Idris, I don't know how many of you are acquainted with the area. It tends to have about 57,000 a year between the 3 paths. Well, 2 paths really that are important are Minffordd on one side on the south and Tullabont Talllyn. We don't count people on the Foxes path. It's too dangerous. We don't like to advertise the Foxes at all because it's in a bad state, so we don't really advertise it. But certainly we do get data from both here. And as you see, the statistical geographical data shows exactly the same as what we've had in Snowdon and Cadir Idris. Days of the week, again, Thursday, a little bit on, well, can only be down to weather, nothing else really. And then over the weekends, usually busy on Saturday and Sunday. And also the annual figures, those are down quite a bit. And again, reflecting that spike in August, bank holiday, this has gone up, not so much with Ogwen, but there are more people, aren't there? What's important here is that gap between the top peak and 2019 is perhaps that is the excess we've seen, as I said previously. So any excess, it's obvious to us, we have trouble coping, parking, you know, overspill parking, road sign camping, etc. At least that isn't much of a gap in the peaks. And it's obvious to me that it's not copable as it is in a way. So perhaps we look at this idea of looking at the transport plan looks at the overspill capacity, etc. Combined with good weather in August, the worst case scenario in a way. It's a good thing for local businesses and getting people out to the country. That's the main purpose of the park, etc. But that little gap between the two peaks there, well, the capacity of overflow really isn't there. And we are struggling with that gap. Other routes, such as Precipice, perhaps those of you who are acquainted with it, it begins in Llanbathrell, outside Olgella. It's very popular, actually. This is route goes through the Nannau estate. It looks down on the 470 as you drive from Ganllwyd. And statistically, this is exactly the same. We call it the Precipice Walk. So there are 23,000 a year, but I would say that most of those are local people. And it hasn't increased much over the year. There's been a steady increase, but that's very popular with local people. And the car park is very full over the weekends, etc. So that's quite consistent there. And these are the figures. It's down quite a bit from 19 to 20, actually. And I don't doubt that lots of local people have been using it during lockdown. The Llanbache, Llangolgella people, etc. Bearing in mind the travel issues. Then the Mawddach Trail. Mawddach is quite interesting because there is a drop-off figure. At the end of August, this drops off anyway, because there are lots of people with children, cyclists, and most of the kids have been going back to school. But as you see, it was exactly the same last year. In 2019, apart from April, May, June, and July, and the drop-off is very sudden. And the kids hadn't gone back to school until later. But that reflects really the more traditional type of statistics. As the park used to be, everything beginning Easter and finishing end of August. But as you can see, statistically, the figures had stretched out on Snowdon and Ogwen, especially if the weather is good. But the Mawddach has stuck to the old trend because it's more family orientated maybe, and that's quite interesting to us. It gets very quiet over the winter. And again, Quirk again, a slight bump up there. That's typical really, weirdness, what happens during the week. And here are the figures with bikes. 41,000 bikes and 2,000 or 3,000 people walking. So it's pretty popular. But as I said, there's a drop-off rate there, regular at the end of August, and it's very quickly becomes flat. So just to compare with 16 to 20 figures. There is a multi-counter on Cader Idris, counting people on bikes twice. It cost about 3,500 to buy, but we have good stats from it, and it's really important for us to have these figures. The two are very similar, exactly the same, and a quick drop off there with the weather. This measures bike, cyclists and pedestrians. So there are two sites. There you can see Amtinacoid. Again, during the week is quite popular, and lots of people drive there. So that is why it's pretty quirky during the week. It peaks on Saturday, but it's really popular during the week as well. And when we had the grants to do the job, we had half the money and half our reserves to do the work. I put it down that it would probably take about 7,000 to 10,000 a year. That was the expectation after spending $500,000, but it has arisen now to almost 30,000 people, with 3,000 people with bikes. So it's a win-win really, because the surface, etc., take what happens on it without being very concerned about it. So that looks after itself in a way. And also, those are the figures for 2020. And there we are. Has anybody got anything they want to ask at all? I'll just close this actually. Thank you. Has anybody got any questions? Yes, Din. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the report as well. Just a quick question, Peter. I was just looking from the viewpoint of Cadair Idris. Do the messages that went out tell people to consider going to other areas? Has that played a role in what's happened with Cadair Idris? We've seen the effect of that coming through. We can't monitor to that level. It just has become really popular, really. I don't think there's a displacement like that. Llyn Tegid was exactly the same. Really busy. It was really busy in August, generally over the park. I had been in Barmouth, Aberdyfi, it was just heaving in August. People didn't travel abroad as well. People had never been in the park before. No connection with countryside or the countryside code. So everybody on the ground will tell you we've had problems with attitudes of some people. We've had problems with people like that. But certainly, what you're asking, yes, Din, there's no evidence for that. But certainly we were busy generally. Question in the chat by Gareth Griffith. When will the figures for this year be available? This year? Well, not until February, really. Give us a break. If anybody wants, we do gather data every 3 or 4 months, but certainly perhaps we'll gather data for September, so the figures from January to September will be available. But we've had problems now with COVID. We've had a job going out, so we're having problems with hardware and software. So after leaving it for so long with COVID, that reflects how we respond now. And if it's possible, we'll do the next collection in September. There will be some figures available for the last season. Thank you, Pete. But not a whole year. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you for that, Pete. These figures are very useful. And can we move on now to a presentation on the work of the Snowdon with that plastic? Catherine is going to present this. No problem, thank you. So this work, as you know, comes from the Snowdon plan for me, and I should consider the no plastic areas on Snowdon, and we're very glad that we have received the report now. And I know you've just accepted it and you haven't had much chance to read it, but we'll have a discussion again on the contents and go into more detail on how we're going to move forward with this. Today, I'm very glad to be able to say that Kat, Jo, Jen and David Gold as well from CGG are joining us and are going to give us a presentation on the work and on the reports. And Kat, Jo and Jen, of course, are part of the team who worked on the report for us from All Travel Without Plastic and Shared Impact. And David is part of the company who did the work of reviewing the soil samples on Snowdon, if you remember. A statement went out about a fortnight ago now, explaining those results, that there were microplastics discovered in every sample that was taken, and quite a high sample specifically on the peak. So that work as well contributes towards all of this. And we have received the report, as I said, and there are education packages as well, and packages for businesses which have been produced, which are very, very useful. And I haven't sent those out, but I will put it in some kind of file so that you can have access to it. But perhaps we'll need to decide how we're going to go about sharing those now. And also, if we share things like that out, where does the responsibility lie? If we share the educational packages, etc., who is going to go to the schools? Who has the capacity to do that? That is a question, perhaps, which is answered in the report. So, yes, warm welcome to you all, therefore, and I'll hand over to you now, Kat, Jo, Jen and David.
Brilliant, thank you everybody, and thanks Catherine. It's really a lovely pleasure to be here and get a chance to report back to you all on the work that we've been doing since March. I think we started March, April time. So we have got about 30 minutes. So the report's 48 pages long, so we're not going into all the detail, but we will certainly give you the highlights, and then we've got 30 minutes for discussion and questions, which I'm sure there'll be plenty of. There's myself and Jo and Jen and David also presenting, so you'll get a bit of variety from us as well. And Jo's kindly doing the slides. So just to give you a very quick overview for those of you that aren't quite as familiar with the project, we had three kind of main objectives: to understand whether plastic-free zones were desirable and possible through consultation with you all and different stakeholders on and around Wyddfa, to assess the challenges that businesses and organisations currently face and create some recommendations that build on existing campaigns and litter reduction frameworks. So we did a full scoping exercise with surveys and interviews of a number of different stakeholders, and then we pulled that together into a report, and then also created with the report our recommendations and proposal for moving forward, which is what we're going to cover today. And then we were also tasked with building a suite of tools and resources for businesses and then schools and education providers, which we've also done. So Jo is going to present back on some of the challenges that we heard from businesses and the resources that she's created around those, and Jen is also going to do the same around the education resources that we've produced. And we're pleased as well that David Gold has joined us as well to just give us, as Catherine said, some insights from his project on microplastics, because that obviously fits into the work, and we've been working alongside that in tandem to make sure that we embed those findings in our recommendations as well. Thanks, Joe. So very quickly, just to go through some of the key findings, and these are just all the highlights summarised in the report. Obviously, all the detail to the survey and the stakeholder interviews and the scoping study in terms of the literature review that we did, which was quite extensive, you can read and makes up the bulk of the report actually. So there's a huge amount of data and information and knowledge that we've kind of pulled together from all sorts of different sources across Wales, the UK and globally, to kind of provide that background information, advice and suggestions, which has then also informed the recommendations that we've made. We realised, well, we knew as well, but we recognised there was quite a lot of information already out there, and it's often very disparate, especially if you're not always focused on this particular topic. And with Joe and Rachel's expertise from Travel Without Plastic, we wanted to kind of bring all that together in one place in the report, so that has been done. So the key findings, obviously, which won't be a surprise to anybody because this is why we're doing the project, but litter is a key problem, and that was confirmed multiple times through the survey, through lots of the stakeholder engagement. One of the key things really that came out though was that although we were really tasked with looking at single-use plastic and plastic as a problem and looking at whether plastic-free status on a Wyddfa and the surrounding areas was desirable, we quickly realised that actually most people recognised, yes, plastic is an issue, but it's part of a bigger problem, i.e. littering, and that stakeholders didn't really want to just focus on one issue of plastic becoming plastic free and reducing single-use plastic, but actually looking at addressing the whole littering issue, and knowing that we can start with single-use plastic as part of that as a targeted agenda, but actually the littering issue is the main problem that needs to be sort of tackled holistically. It also became fairly apparent, both in terms of the research that we were doing and the conversations we were having with businesses and locals around a sense that there was a real lack of awareness, understanding and appreciation for the scale and impact of the problem by visitors, residents and businesses. And I think that's natural in terms of we all have, our understanding of the impact we're having as an organisation, a business, etc. But we don't necessarily think about the scale of that when we're thinking about the numbers that Peter's just shared as well. Like, we're not always constantly aware, even if we're here in August and even if we're resident here all the time, of the cumulative effect of everybody, I'm not saying everybody, but the vast majority of contributing to littering in some kind of way, which obviously creates the problem. We did find throughout the scoping study that there was full support for both creating a plastic-free mountain campaign and status, and also, as I said, to tackle litter more widely, both on a Wyddfa and kind of hotspot areas, but also right across the park. And I think, again, that's for the park and you as stakeholders to really decide where you want to target and focus your attention, because there are different areas obviously that are affected differently. Existing strategies primarily focus on litter removal currently rather than prevention, and that's brilliant, and it's great that we've got those in place, but we kind of have looked at other ways of deepening that removal, but also exploring how we can actually prevent the problem. And I think this came up most from businesses in terms of supply chains and the challenges for them in terms of actually replacing a lot of their contribution to the issue, which they fully recognise, but aren't necessarily sure how to start making some of those significant long-term changes when people want crisps, and crisps generally come in foil and plastic combined packaging that isn't necessarily always easy to recycle, and it certainly isn't biodegradable either. So there's lots of things there about in the report, lots of different suggestions and things that Joe and Rachel have referred to in terms of other examples of how that could be looked at. We also then looked at stakeholders stakeholders want to see long-term sustainable change in terms of attitudes and behaviours, and recognise and regularly said that they didn't want this to just be, and I don't think we've not had any sign of this from Snowdonia National Park, but this isn't a short-term fix. There's no short-term quick wins. This has to be a long-term agenda that has long-term outcomes and impact. We're not going to change people's attitudes overnight. It's got to be a sustained campaign and see it as part of a long-term solution to reducing litter in the park. As I was saying, businesses also highlighted the need for additional support to implement changes in the supply chain of products and packaging, and also increase in diversified waste disposal options in the region, because this was one of the challenges that businesses said they were facing, is either misunderstanding about what was available, or the way that they wanted to be able to dispose different materials wasn't available, or it was too costly. Thanks, Joe. And then, yeah, there was significant research and evidence to support a variety of strategies to achieve Snowdonia National Park's objectives. So we've put all of those that we've come across, we're aware of, and also ones we've created specifically for Snowdonia in the report. There are already numerous organisations and groups working to tackle litter, reduce single-use plastic, and support businesses to make changes. So we kind of had an assumption that that would be the case because of this increased interest in tackling single-use plastic in particular, but also tackling litter and making, you know, certainly our wild spaces much more natural and not having waste and litter, but also a greater appreciation around, you know, becoming more of a circular economy and changing the materials and the use and reducing our waste more generally across society. So when we actually did the research and looked into this, we found lots and lots of organisations, grassroots groups, voluntary organisations, organisations and groups acting in the area that, you know, have this as a priority as well, whether or not it's their core business or agenda. But I think in most cases we found that everybody was working in their own spaces and, you know, with their own communities, and we saw an opportunity there really to think about how this is brought together to utilise the energy and commitment of those individuals, organisations and communities that are already really kind of committed to this and have been working on this for a while, because it's not new, but it's kind of building on the experience of those people and the energy that they have as well. One of the big issues that did come up a lot through businesses was the issue of takeaway packaging, and then obviously, as I said, general packaging in the supply chain. And we've looked at different ways for businesses to kind of look at that and consider that. We recognise that in some cases there was a lack of consistency across the different counties and areas around waste disposal and recycling, and not so much, we weren't able to look in terms of the actual things, but there was a sense amongst the businesses that this was a case, and that so they were confused and unsure of what was possible and what solutions are available. So I'm not saying that those things aren't available, it's just that they weren't necessarily aware of them, and a lack of kind of understanding around that issue. There was also overall agreement that communication with visitors is obviously key to creating long-term change, and then we put a few recommendations in the report around that and how this can all be tied together through other general communications. And there's still work to be done to get to the root cause of why people litter. When we looked at research that's done across the UK and globally, and particularly in tourist areas, there's no one particular answer, and there's a lot of research going on into this now in terms of attitudes and behaviours. But there is still those people that just don't care. I don't think necessarily we're going to change necessarily that, and probably not the people to focus on. I think what's much more likely is most people are aware and do care, but it's often, you know, attitudes and behaviours around, well, and let's go back to that thing that I said at the beginning, well, you know, I'm just one person, or I'm not thinking about the actions that I'm taking, I'm not thinking about the collective. So they were kind of our key findings. I think Joe, this was, yeah. And from the scoping study then, we pulled all that data together and kind of reviewed it. There was obviously an interest in developing plastic-free Snowdonia and Wyddfa, and having a campaign around that. So our proposal is that the Snowdonia National Park does undertake a litter-free Snowdonia initiative, which includes the aim to achieve plastic-free mountain status, which for us is really key in terms of looking at that wider issue of litter, because tackling just the plastic issue would be a great start, but it's not the end. And so we didn't want to miss that. And I think even from the early conversations we had with everybody at the park, it was really obvious that it wasn't just plastic that was the issue or the thing that we wanted to tackle. So that's why we focused on that. Nice. And this is just one very summary slide of some of the survey responses in terms of one of the questions we asked in the survey: what do you think is the main cause of the problem? But as you'll see when you look at the report, there's all sorts of data in there that provides really interesting insights. And yeah, so we just wanted to share some of that, but we haven't got time to go into all of that at the moment. But I want to pass over to Joe now, who's going to share some, oh no, sorry, it's David, who's going to talk about the microplastics. So thank you, David.
No problem. So thanks, Kat, for the introduction, and yeah, thanks for the opportunity to present our results to you this morning. So I'll just sort of share the key findings with you all very quickly. Just a few slides. So we performed a pilot microplastic survey on Wyddfa back in April of this year. And you would have seen from Pete's slides earlier on, that's just sort of right before the main visitor season.
O'n i wedi gweld y llun.
Collect samples along the Cranberries path, and again, you've seen from Pete's slides, it's probably the busiest walking route to the summit. So we thought that route at least would have the best opportunity for us to collect microplastics from. Once we collect the samples, we took them
So we wedi, wel mae fe wedi mynd off y sgrin, na gyd, right. So rwsyd na gilydd, wi ddim yn y cyfarfod nawr, right, okay, so a'n ôl, mae nath Catrin hela link, nid fi nawr te. Nath Catrin anfon link I fi. Mae hwnnw wedi diflannu eto nawr. Mae'r link wedi, a'n ôl mewn I Zoom falle, Rob, ie? Zoom. O, dwi mewn nawr.
From the X-ray spectra, we're able to identify.
Rob, wi mewn nawr. Rob.
That we relate back to our sort of dictionary of materials within our database. So the benefit of this approach really is we can scan a large number of samples very quickly, and we can see the microplastics in this instance in the context of the surrounding soil. So it gives us a good idea of what's actually going on in the soil. Just some limitations on the sort of sampling strategy is that we only took samples from that one path, and perhaps if we collected a greater number of samples across the other main walking routes up to the summit, will give us a better picture of the state of microplastic pollution on the mountain. And we only took surface samples as well, and perhaps if we took some cores instead, you'll be able to see how levels of perhaps microplastic pollution has changed through time. So Joe, could you please move on to the next slide? So these are just sort of the key findings from, say, 2 of the samples. So in all of the samples that we analysed, we found variable amounts of microplastic. The majority kind of had background levels of around about 1%, and these are fairly comparable to sort of background levels of microplastics that we've found in other sites in North Wales that we've analysed, such as the Conwy estuary or the Dee estuary. But these 2 images here show the 2 sites with the highest concentration. So these occurred at the summit and along the railway bridge. You can see sort of the top and bottom here. The grey circles in sort of the centre of the screen, this is a digital image of the sample itself, and we've greyed out the images of all the other minerals within those samples, and we've just highlighted the presence of microplastics in pink just to help it sort of stand out better. And you can see these are contain lots of sort of small, fragmented and abraded particles. These are likely to have come from the breakdown of larger pieces of litter, as Kat has said. It's that sort of correlation between the microplastics and the plastics pollution and the wider litter problem. And to the right of the image here, you can see that these are pie charts that show the sort of the composition of the samples, and you can see that most of the samples contain fairly typical minerals like quartz and feldspars and clay minerals, but in pink here you can see there's quite a large amount of microplastic, around about 5% in both of these sites. So Joe, can you move on to the next slide, please? So just to summarize the key findings and put it in a little bit of context, really, all the samples contained plastics. Perhaps unsurprisingly, most of the microplastics, or the areas with the highest concentrations, were sites where large numbers of people tend to congregate, such as the summit. And although 5% microplastic pollution may not sound like a huge amount, if all the soil on Snowdon contained 5% microplastics, and we scaled that up to the size of the mountain itself, that would actually cover an area of 5 square kilometers. That's enough to cover the whole of the Great Orme in microplastics. So it just kind of shows you, hopefully that gives you a sort of a mental image of the scale of microplastic pollution that we discovered at the summit, at least on Wyddfa. If you can go to my final slide now, Joe, thank you. And this just shows sort of all the data in one sort of handy little picture, really. This shows our microplastic pollution index data dashboard. You can see in the bar graphs at the bottom here, most of the sites contain sort of 1% plastic. These have fairly low microplastic pollution index ratings. But at the railway bridge and at the summits, you can see these have the highest microplastic pollution indices. And you can see these displayed on the map in sort of these red circles here. So they have values of pollution ratings of between 5 and 6. And you can display these ratings quite easily on a map, and you can use that map to perhaps identify where you've got plastic pollution hotspots. And perhaps these are areas that you may want to focus on to perhaps put some posters up to increase awareness about litter, or perhaps place a few extra litter bins. And this technique really could be used as part of a long-term solution. So you can go back to the sites over a period of time and retake the samples, reanalyze them, and you might be able to see the levels of microplastic pollution reducing in response to perhaps any mitigation measures that are sort of agreed and in place after this discussion this morning. So thank you very much for listening to the results. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them at the end, but perhaps I'll hand over back to Joe now to present the business tools. So thank you very much.
Brilliant, thanks, David. So many of you will probably know already that Travel Without Plastic's main role in the project was to look at what was preventing businesses from being able to effectively reduce unnecessary single-use plastic, and to prevent pollution, and what potential solutions we would be able to suggest. And businesses responded to a question about those challenges in the survey that Kat mentioned at the beginning, and you can see the top results here in the table. And whilst we obviously can't control the prices of alternatives, we're already working on a platform that makes alternatives easier to source. This is something that's outside of this project. It's something that Travel Without Plastic's been working on for over a year already, but what we'd really love to be able to do would be to find and include Welsh suppliers of alternatives in the Greener Guest marketplace. So if anybody that's joined us today is aware of suppliers of alternatives, it'd be great if you could let us know. And as Kat mentioned, food packaging is also very much a supply chain issue, which was out of the scope of this project in particular at this phase, but certainly an issue that other organisations are working on and that we hope yields positive results very soon. And just to highlight around the COVID-19 compliance, one of the things that we've already been able to do at Greener Guest is to create an online training on how accommodation providers can reduce single-use plastic whilst keeping staff and guests safe. So it's specifically designed for hotels and a kind of package style, or larger hotels, but the learning is applicable to every hospitality business really, and it's free to take the course. So we're very happy for people to share that. We also ask businesses to choose from a list of resources that would help them in terms of reducing unnecessary single-use plastic. And we left an open question to capture any other support businesses might find helpful. So you can see those under the yellow line. As part of the project, we obviously only had a limited amount of time. So we chose the top 3 themes for the business tools that you can see highlighted there in bold. which is the clarity on the real meaning of product labels, and that causes a lot of confusion, how to communicate with guests, customers and visitors, and how to source alternative products. So what we did, as Catherine explained at the beginning, is we created a number of business resources. So just to very quickly run through a summary of what these are. The guide on understanding terminology around plastics helps to address the real meaning of the product labels, and it's designed to help businesses to do some more due diligence when it comes to making a buying decision. And we look at what does it really mean, you know, when a product's advertised as compostable or biodegradable or recyclable. And we include a range of recommendations about what businesses can do to make sure they don't get sucked into any greenwash claims. The communicating plastic reduction to customers obviously came up as a key challenge for businesses, as you saw. So this guide focuses on getting guests, but also staff to buy into the changes. And there are three core aims. There's reassurance, leading by example, and businesses showing that they care. So we share tips on choosing the right words, choosing them in the right way so that they're effective, the importance of knowing your audience as a business and of being really honest, and definitely the impact that communications can have, even if you're not doing things perfectly at the moment, but to take your guests, your customers and your staff on that journey with you. And then finally, how to source alternative products we covered in the Finding Alternatives Pros and Cons worksheet, which we accompanied with an Eliminating and Replacing Single-Use Plastic guide. And so what that helps businesses to do is make decisions that are also based on operational choices, and that encourage overall waste reduction rather than just a simple switch to other single-use alternatives. Another thing we did was just create an easy to read version of the audit checklist. I'll tell you about the audit in a second. And that was for an audit for accommodation providers and an audit for restaurants and cafes. So we wanted to make that in an easy to read format so that businesses have access to that criteria. And depending on the next steps, obviously, we could work on more resources, think about how to prevent them differently, maybe not just as guides, but as interactive content or as part of the ambassador program. These, again, are all things that we can discuss and that yourselves as stakeholders can consider. So just to explain a little bit more about the audits, as part of the project, we planned to do 6 pilot audits. Ideally 3 with accommodation providers and 3 with coffee shops or restaurants. We had interest from 5 businesses that had responded to the survey and that we connected with, but for timing and other operational requirements within the businesses, it meant we were only able to perform 2 of those audits in the project time. So there's still space for us to do this with 4 more businesses, and we're happy to do that. And so they were developed, the audits, to support the potential for businesses to be part of the plastic-free mountain status. And we also wanted to assess the application of criteria in a local context and to engage local businesses with the process, but also to help us find if there were any potential common challenges that businesses might face in terms of compliance. And those challenges that we did identify echo those that we've already heard from previous speakers, and in previous slides. So a lack of available cost-effective alternatives and plastic within the supply chain over which businesses have no control. A good example of this is like biscuits for the tea and coffee trays in rooms. You know, businesses really want to buy local products, but the vast majority are wrapped in plastic. Other issues that came up were outsourced laundry, for instance, being returned in plastic, and a lack of suppliers that are willing to take back bulk packaging like cleaning products, so that packaging could be cleaned and reused. So those challenges don't mean that we would necessarily adapt the criteria to fit, but the achievements of the standard could be progressive. So for example, the SUP-free, a micro certification for single-use plastic that we've based this on, that Travel Without Plastic is the knowledge partner for, that has 3 compliance levels. So the first is eliminating all customer-facing plastic. The second, eliminating operational single-use plastic over which the business has direct control, and then a third level of compliance where businesses really try to influence the supply chain and other stakeholders that they're in contact with. And it was really interesting actually to undertake the online audits. In some ways, I think they're even more robust than one in real life, because you're so concerned about missing something when you do it online that you really go into so much extra effort. The audits that we did were with Glenperris Guest House and with Greg Wen, and they were fantastic because we identified some really brilliant new COVID-friendly processes to breakfast services that don't require single-use plastic, for example. And the more audits that are done, the more likelihood that we find great examples that we can share with others. This is what we're currently helping to do at SUP Free. So we find it really exciting that we've got these great ideas. So there's a lot to discuss around potential next steps, and there'll be time for that at the end. But for now, I'll hand over to Jen to tell us a little bit more about the resources that they've created for educational facilities and how they could be rolled out.
Hi, Jo. I'm going to cover for Jen because she's got to go on to another meeting, unfortunately. So apologies for that. But any questions that do come up, if we can't answer them, we can forward them on to Jen, and she's very happy to kind of follow up with anybody with details on the resources. So this is just giving, I think there's 2 slides here, there's giving a sort of overview of the education resources that Jen and her team created. And the purpose of this is specifically for schools. And we looked at key stages 2, 3 and 4, but actually they could be used by any educational organisation or group that kind of is working with those age groups. So we wanted to kind of provide similar resources, but for the different age groups and key stages. And Jen and the team, because of their experience in doing this, have looked at how this kind of crosses over, particularly in schools and education, how this crosses over to the curriculum here in Wales as well. So looked really specifically at how they can be built in either to specifics or project work or into existing curriculum work as well. So because of the number of kind of materials with each of the resources, and that's just because of the way that Jen and Solutions to the Planet create amazing resources, there's a kind of resource index to help educators kind of, when they come across each of the resources, understand which materials go with each resource. So it's really, really clearly outlined. So although it looks quite complex here, it is really, really simple and straightforward. And they're designed in a way that, you know, educators will understand. They're in the usual format that teachers and educators will be used to in terms of lesson plans, and then the materials to go with them, both for themselves and for the students to use as well. There is a lot of, and I can't quite see the detail, and I'm just wondering if I can open the report. 1 second, so I can give you the overview, because I can't read off here to give you or I can come back to that in a minute if you've got specific questions I can go through. But each of the resources, this just shows the kind of outline of the objectives of the education resource, the actual kind of resources that are attached to the materials, the actual description of the activity. And then also we added in, I think for most of the resources, was whether there was an extension to the classroom-based activity, to thinking about how that could actually be taken outdoors. Because we recognise that obviously being the national park, education is great in the classroom, but it's even better when you're in the place that you're talking about. And particularly for those schools and education providers that are in the park or very close to the park, we thought, well, why not explore the opportunity to actually see where these can be extended, so that the groups and trips can be built in as well, if that's possible, even if that is just outside the school, you know, in the school grounds. You know, in many places you can actually obviously see the mountains. You're in the national park, so you can kind of just stepping outside the classroom can make a big difference. So just in summary, obviously to cover Jen's slides off, key thinking was around aligning it with the curriculum here in Wales, providing standalone activities which could be built into existing learning or just be delivered on their own, but so that they're really, really flexible to use. Idea being that they are delivered in school by teachers or in partnership, so with different organisations going in to deliver them, but also, as I said, other organisations could potentially use them in their own educational activities. Really key to kind of promoting practical engagement with the mountain, which is why we've added in that extension for outdoor learning as well, where that's possible. And a couple of recommendations around thinking more about how these can be developed with more engagement with young people. That was one of the challenges in terms of the time frame and the challenges around education that schools have been experiencing anyway this past year, was really not having the chance to involve young people in the way that we wanted to. So we think these can be adapted and developed more with young people's engagement, and also looking at how ongoing project-based work with young people around the mountain could work to help build the Plastic Free campaign as well, so that they're involved and feel ownership and responsibility of that to inspire action. So I think, oh no, I've still got a couple more slides, but I will go through these very quickly so we get a chance to answer any questions and discussion, and you can obviously look at the more detailed recommendations in the report as well. But we felt that these were to kind of help you take the next steps. And so our recommendations were in terms of creating a process for managing this initiative across Snowdon National Park, which will obviously be key to the partnership and for Aurora, but also thinking about how it's actually delivered and managed. Create a specific role to lead and manage this initiative. We recognise that actually thinking about this long term, it really needed a lead person to kind of steer the direction, because there's so much from the report in terms of what could be delivered, that it's actually probably helpful to have somebody leading on that. Obviously that requires, and delivery of some of the recommendations requires investment in funding, so we've kind of shared a recommendation around that and looking at different ways that could possibly be looked at. Recommendation to obviously build on what's already happening. From what I said before, there's already a lot going on, both in Gwynedd and Conway, but also in the wider North Wales area, as well as globally for national parks and tourist areas. So it's really worth looking at what's going on and how you can build on existing initiatives rather than thinking you have to create all this new stuff. Recognising and encouraging sharing of good practice, being a catalyst for the refill movement. So particularly we spoke to Refill Wales, and they're very keen to set up Refill Wales in Snowdonia and support that with more businesses and organisations, so that more people are used to having refillable bottles, particularly water bottles, but also other sources of drinks as well through refill, which could reduce significantly the number of plastic bottles. And obviously then promoting alternative products and services that help businesses reduce single-use plastic using the resources that Joe has talked about. And one more slide, I think, Joe. Yeah. So being part of the process to advocate and collaborate for change, not just with visitors and businesses, but more strategically with other agencies, councils and national government. Creating a cohesive communication strategy that obviously supports and leverages partner communications for greater consistency. Thinking about how events contribute to the problem but can also be part of the solution as a way to kind of implement change and create awareness, because there are a lot of events that go on around the park. Exploring the possibility of co-funding and sponsorship. So in one of the recommendations we kind of look at that and kind of both the limitations and the challenges with that, but some of the opportunities that might be there for the park to consider. And to review procurement across all visitor centres and premises as a very specific thing that the park authority can do in terms of their contribution as well. Obviously then building confidence during COVID-19 recovery and how this all builds into the long-term plans of the tourist industry here going forward, and specific challenges for businesses around keeping the staff and visitors safe. And there was also a recommendation at the end to just continue to consider the potential for enforcement practices. There wasn't actually much interest in the enforcement idea, particularly because it's not clear how you would enforce it in terms of the capacity and scale and the remoteness of a lot of this happening, but certainly something to explore in the future as well in terms of the communications aspect of it. So sorry we rushed through that last bit, but I do want to kind of make sure we had plenty of time to answer questions, discuss next steps. So yeah, we're open for for that. Joe, I don't know if you could close the slides so I can see everybody.
Right. A rhan y partneriaid I gyd, ga I just deud diolch I
I'll
Cat.
just say thank you to you for that presentation. It was most interesting. Okay, we'll open up now to questions and comments. Just give us a shout or raise your hand or whatever. Who wants to begin? Can I start, John?
Well, very good. I was quite inspired about that. I think it's a great idea. Lots of good ideas in there. There's a couple of questions and a couple of ideas actually. Can I ask David, how long do these various plastic molecules eventually break up, David, at all? Or are they incredibly persistent?
They are incredibly persistent. They tend to just break down into smaller and smaller particles. So the lifespan of these particles sort of tend to last, many hundreds or maybe even thousands of years in the environment. So I think just over time, sedimentary processes and the action of the weather will act to break down these particles, but they're all still out there, just in sort of very small dimensions. And what you tend to find is that if they're sort of picked up by sort of incorporated into plants as they grow, or ingested by animals, this tends to have a cumulative effect as well in their bodies, and these sort of plastic levels build up, and then they enter the food chain, and it just escalates that way. So yeah, it's quite a persistent problem.
It's interesting that the correlation between ordinary litter, plastic litter, and microplastics has never been highlighted, really, I don't think, anywhere. Although people are aware of microplastics, people are aware of litter, but the actual fact of leaving litter leading to microplastics has not been really come to the front of the argument, I suspect, and from what I know over the years. I was just thinking, and talking about other stuff now, is that maybe we might want to, what you put together is a two-pronged approach, is what we could do with actually, is some kind of Snowdon protocol for businesses, sign up to the plastic protocol, and also then a more regional, national scale stuff. So split the two things into two really, with all the messages that you've highlighted. That's the kind of way that I would take it forward from here, actually. But anyway, that's for another discussion. Thank you very much for a very informative presentation.
Diolch, Pete. Charles?
Thank you, John. Just a couple of points. Firstly, the cafe on the top of Snowdon. I haven't been there for a couple of years, but when I was last there were plenty of plastic bottles of Coke being dished up over the counter. The difficulty is that unless things have changed, I'm not aware that there's a running water supply. So everything's going to have to be bussed up the mountain on a train in bottles or containers. And I think that is a fundamental issue. I know it's been talked about packaging and everything else, but in my view, there's an immediate concern about that, because clearly people will be buying stuff from the cafe and then drinking it and then possibly adding to the problem up on the top. And I think that is a fundamental issue. I know it's a commercial organisation, and I suspect probably they're the first people. And if we can get them as a sort of prototype or get them on board initially to do that. But there again, it's going to cost more, I'm sure, with people buying water and stuff when they get up to the top and want to drink. So again, there's probably some subsidy or something there needed. Going on to the education element, I probably think that most school children are probably far more aware of plastics than possibly us old people are, or older people are. And I can't help feeling we probably need some education as well as the school children in the process. And the other thing is obviously looking at Peter's statistics, a lot of people come from away. They're not, so how do we reach out to people outside the Snowdonia in the education system into England and all the rest of it? As I said, I'm not necessarily asking for solutions, but just sort of points that I think perhaps we need to think about rather, rather than just trying to home in on the locality, because I suspect probably the local people are pretty good and they're very familiar with the issues. It's reaching outside the boundaries of Wales and to the older generations. And you always see when you're walking in the countryside, you know where people have been. You see sweet papers that come out of someone's pocket. But wherever you see people, there's always litter, I'm afraid. It's just fact of life. But anyway, I've probably said enough. Thank you.
Lots of useful stuff in there, Charles. I'll just comment briefly. I do think that your idea that the education package or the education process maybe should be led by our young people is a really good one, and we should really be seriously thinking about how we do that. But does Catherine or Kat, would you like to respond very briefly on the point about businesses actually on the mountain themselves, particularly the railway?
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, you go, Catherine.
I was o'n I just yn mynd I sôn yn sydyn amdan.
Yes, I was just going to mention very quickly the points. I'll wait for Kat to mention businesses, etc. But we have worked with on a tender with Arloesi Gwynedd Wledig, and we've looked at options for water supplies, and we're looking at the technology which is available, and perhaps we could establish some kind of water sources at the foot of the mountains or wherever. It's extremely challenging, but we are going to look into that. So that is in the pipeline, but I'll allow Kat to come in to talk about the businesses.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. And thanks, Charles, because I think those points you made, all of them were really, really good ones and important ones for you guys to consider long term as well. I agree with Catherine. I think the long-term plan to have water refills, particularly on the top of Snowdon, is going to be a long-term, infrastructure challenge and thing to explore. But I think we address that in the report in the detail of some various different solutions, which I think actually there isn't a single solution to any of these problems. It's about looking at multiple ways to tackle the problem, over time. So obviously, yes, supporting the cafe and other businesses on the mountain to be commercially viable, and working with them. We did struggle to engage a number of the businesses on the Wyddfa, I think because of the time of year, because of COVID, because of staff challenges and things, as well as other issues. But we did engage with some of them who were already doing things to look at refill with visitors and changing materials and stuff, which was really great to see that there was interest in that. There is obviously a particular challenge in terms of getting materials and drinks and food to the top of the mountain, which has to be explored specifically with that business. But I think the other ideas that we've built into the report in terms of encouraging people to think about being prepared, which is a big message anyway, taking their own food and drink with them, and providing, even if it's at the base of the mountain or at the base of walking routes, provision for refill and stuff is the start of actually creating that change as well, as long as with lots of the other things that we've talked about. Yeah, I totally agree that in my experience, so I am one of the directors of Solutions for the Planet, and having worked in education with them for the last 8 or 9 years, yeah, young people are very aware of the plastic issue because of all the publicity that goes on around that now, particularly targeted at young people. And I think there's a lot to learn from them and the work that they're doing. Solutions for the Planet do have a process for supporting organisations with that, if you're interested in engaging young people in that way, specifically to have their input and feedback and ideas. But there's lots of different ways you can do that as well. And I also agree with your other point, Charles, that actually, yeah, when we have put into the recommendations, which I probably wasn't explicit about working with partners such as Business Wales to explore more education on some of the specific things that we've talked about in the report and that Joe's created resources around, that are working in accommodation, tourism, provision, etc. But also generally, helping adults, particularly in the business and tourism sectors, thinking about what are the specific issues, what are the challenges, how does that play out, and what are the first steps that they can be taking to make changes, because sometimes it feels like a mammoth task, but actually small incremental changes make a big difference. And yeah, I think one of the things that came up is this: how do we communicate both in the park, but also before people arrive, with potential visitors, with new people, you know, visiting the area. Some of that we've explored, and I think the park's general communications do that. You know, you're always looking, you're not just communicating to residents and locals, you're always communicating to people outside the area, because we know that it's a, you know, increasing tourist attraction and people want to come and visit. So I think it's using the existing and some other strategies that we've put in the report around thinking about, well, how can you create that change? But I would caution, and I think this has come up a lot in the conversations, is local people are we're just as guilty, as you said, either because we've got stuff in our pockets and our bags. I live in Bethesda. We have a litter issue in Bethesda that is residential and it's here all year. It's nothing to do with visitors. So I think it's really important. This is a societal issue. It's not a visitor tourist specific issue. It's just that we have hotspots here in the park that are, you know, a lot more people condensely in areas that actually make it a real highlighted issue.
Diolch, Cat. Ateb cynhwysfawr.
Thank you, Kath. That is a comprehensive answer. We have 10 minutes. Angela, then Emma, and then Gareth. So we'll try and squash you all in. Thank you, Angela. Yes, just a comment by me, not a question really, just to say that we've done quite a lot of work with Bangor University, changing habits with rubbish, and they want to continue with that relationship, and they are going to allocate MSc students to us with a topic of rubbish from now on. So that is going to sort of strengthen this element of the work and assist us as well with things as well. So that's just for information, really. Thank you, Angela. Emma?
Hi, morning everyone. Thanks, that was a really interesting presentation. I think I've got sort of part comment, part question really. I was interested in the mix of businesses that you looked at in terms of how many businesses you talked to through your survey and what type of businesses they were. You know, I think B&Bs obviously are in previous work found them the most engaging sort of sector, part of the accommodation sector to work with. But I suspect that the bulk of our issues probably lie with people who are staying in self-catering accommodation, campsites and holiday parks. And they are difficult to engage with generally. But I think some sort of wider scale targeting, I think possibly this is something we as a group need to think in terms of how to take this forward now, as to how we engage with those businesses that are probably higher volume and more difficult to engage with. And we've got a two-level stage of behaviour change there to do. One is the business behaviour change, and then they're getting them to an influence and help overcome the barriers to their visitors actually being better with their litter. The second point was a point about education. You know, the schools are under pressure. Trying to get increased curriculum time to do outdoor learning is really, really difficult, especially at the moment. The one option that is available, of course, is that well, up until COVID, we had many hundreds of thousands of children from the rest of the UK coming into the area via outdoor activity providers and education centres. And that, to me, getting an element of sustainability and responsibility into those courses and via those activity providers is one way that we can influence the next generation of visitors who are going to grow up and come back and bring their kids back to the area. And that's something that we could help facilitate in terms of engaging with them. So sort of part question, part well, possible answers really, I suppose.
Okay.
Do you want me to come back, John, on those?
Kat, would you like to just briefly come back on that, and then we'll...
Yeah, thanks, Emma. I think they're really, really important points. We did look at, I don't know, if Joe, if you've got the stats in front of you, but we did look at, we tried to reach a whole range of businesses and organisations across the tourism sector. So we weren't just focused on accommodation. And I think from memory, accommodation was probably one of the smallest responses really that we had in terms of overall. So we looked at, you know, cafes and anybody really that's engaging with any type of visitor in the area, and looked at the different challenges that, you know, different types of businesses are facing. And I do agree with you, like, you know, you're going to have the biggest impact working with those that are the largest initially and have the highest engagement rates with visitors, you know, in across all different areas. So I do agree that it's best to kind of think strategically about where you can have greatest impact first, so that you are reaching the businesses to change if they need changing attitudes. I think a lot of businesses we spoke to, and this probably is a bias in the survey and the approach we took anyway, were already very interested in this area. They just weren't sure what steps to take if they weren't already doing stuff. Many of them were already doing things and wanted to go another step further, but recognized that they needed support around education and specifics and kind of how to still make it work for their business. And particularly this year, you know, most of them also said to us, we're just trying to survive. This is an important issue, but right now we're just literally trying to get through the next 12 months. And I think there was that real tension for many of them as well. But yeah, definitely agree that focusing on those businesses that have the highest volumes of visitors, where they can have most change, and actually small changes can have the biggest impact as well, where they're kind of willing to do that. And I totally agree in terms of, and I think this is probably something we probably missed, Joe, it's my fault, but he's thinking about outdoor activity centres and education providers. But absolutely, I think there's no reason why the resources couldn't be used in those settings, and would be a great way to build in that education for young people and families outside of the area, especially when they're doing outdoor learning anyway. But also I think we did get some really good positive responses from a number of activity-based businesses, outdoor pursuit centres and things like that. And I think there's an element of those who are very, very committed to the natural environment and are very much on board with this and are really excited to see what the park's next steps are, and are really committed to being involved in that process. And I think considering the number of visitors that they work with very closely on a one-to-one level and have conversations with, you know, just through hiring out a canoe, a kayak, you know, a stand-up paddleboard, etc., across all the other things, I think that's a huge opportunity actually for reaching large numbers with very simple messaging, you know, around, you know, this is, you know, when you go out, please consider these things and don't leave, you know, litter, waste, etc. So I think, yeah, taking that a little bit further as well. But thank you, Anna. Those are really great comments and questions.
Yeah, diolch, Kat.
Thank you, Kat, and thank you for Hannah for what she put in the chat about case studies and with large businesses. It sounds very interesting. Gareth. Thank you. And thank you for the invitation today. It's been so interesting to me. And I, as a member of Cabinet of Gwynedd Council, well, we have been looking at the problem of dog mess, which is a general mess on our streets, etc. And also, more recently, there's been a problem with PPE masks being thrown everywhere. I was glad that Charles had raised the point that we must educate more widely than just in this area. I'm not saying that every child and adult in this area puts rubbish where they should, but I do think that since the pandemic, people have been seeing problems and the local people do respond to it better than previously, I believe. But I think that we have to educate people more widely and perhaps cooperate with other national parks, because they are all, from what I understand, with the same problems that we face here. I was talking with somebody recently, and the point this person made was quite easy. We all know that it's wrong to throw rubbish. We've been taught this in primary school. It's not rocket science, but we know that it isn't the right thing to do. And therefore, how do we deal with that? It's great that you know, this ideas about talking with businesses, etc. That's fantastic. I think that many of the problems, what I see as a local member, a councillor here in Fellinhelly, is people come here for a day with a picnic and leave rubbish behind. They're willing to carry the picnic here, but they're not willing to carry the rubbish home. One thing I'm interested in, and I don't know whether, I'm just saying this for you to consider, what about enforcing fines, etc. To somebody? I'm not talking about somebody who, you know, drops a small piece of paper, but somebody who genuinely throws a lot of rubbish on the mountains and along the paths, etc. It's just something to consider. But I'm glad to hear these ideas which have been put forward. It's great. It's very close to my heart. So I'm going to go after this with them. So thank you to you all. Thank you, Gareth. And on that topic of education and communication, as part of this year's work programme, Carrierary, the movements which are part of this partnership have done work and targeted, well, they've had messages out to audiences who are much further away. So it is early days, but the work of how to communicate and what media to use, what messages to send, and what audiences we need to reach, that work has begun. And of course, there's a lot to be done. Catherine, do you want to come back on anything that's been said? Yes, just to conclude, John, I'd like to thank you all for coming here. It's very good to see a good representation of all the ones here today. It's very heartening to see you here. And the first step will be for us as a team within the park and in partnership with Snowdon to look at the possibility of having some money to put an officer in place, because I think it deserves that. The amount of work qualifies, you know, having somebody to look at this specifically. And it's a long term. So that is what we'll be doing now. So we're looking at that. And they'll cooperate, so that is the ethos. So we are cooperating with Gwynedd Council and Rural Gwynedd already, and you all as partners, that is will be all important as we take this work forward. And yes, beginning perhaps with the Snowdon, and then as Pete mentioned, there is that's the work. But thank you all for coming, and thank you, John, as well. Thank you all for attending, and of course, everybody who has contributed, and to Catherine and Elith for translating, and Catherine for arranging it. Thank you very much, and all the best. Bye-bye.